The word tea hung in the air like something impossible. Commander Yuna stood frozen in the doorway, her massive form casting shadows across the cracked marble floor. Her forearms remained posed with weapons that could destroy cities, but she had not moved for 30 long seconds. The energy field around her armor flickered and dimmed like a candle in the wind. The remaining aliens in the room stared in complete horror at what they thought was surely the stupidest human who had ever lived. The Kellen representative was making small whimpering sounds. The crystal beings had stopped their humming entirely, which meant they were either deeply shocked or already dead from fear. Commander Yuna repeated slowly, and her voice had lost some of its artificial thunder. The words sounded strange coming from her, like she was tasting something she had forgotten existed. Her helmet tilted further to one side, and the red glow behind her visor seemed less bright, somehow less angry and more confused. Taemin nodded calmly toward the small table he had set up in the corner of the room. It looked ridiculously tiny next to all the grand diplomatic furniture they had rushed to install. A simple wooden table with a plain white cloth, 2 cups that his mother had given him for his apartment, a small pot for brewing tea, and a thermos of hot water he had brought from home. Green tea, actually, he said, as if offering refreshments to a 3-meter-tall war goddess was the most normal thing in the world. I brought some from my grandmother's garden in Busan. She grew it herself in the old traditional way. She always said that tea from your own soil tastes like home. He walked to his table with steady steps that surprised even him. His hands did not shake as he began the familiar ritual of preparing tea, the same way his grandmother had taught him when he was 7 years old. The same way he did every morning before work. Measure the leaves carefully, heat the water to just the right temperature, pour slowly and with respect. Commander Yuna watched every movement. Her weapons had not retracted, but they were no longer pointed directly at him. The other aliens had pressed themselves against the walls, trying to become invisible. The air still crackled with dangerous energy, but something had shifted. Something small, but important. You are not afraid, she observed, and this time her voice sounded genuinely curious rather than threatening. The artificial boom was fading, replaced by something that sounded almost normal, almost like a regular person asking a regular question. It was still deep and powerful, but now it reminded Taemin of distant thunder instead of an earthquake. Oh, I am terrified, Taemin admitted as he poured hot water over the green tea leaves. I am probably more scared than I have ever been in my entire life. My hands should be shaking, my voice should be cracking. I should probably be running away, screaming like that bird person. Did he looked up at her towering form and smiled again, that same warm, genuine smile that had stopped her cold just minutes before. But fear and kindness are not opposites, he continued, stirring the tea gently. My grandmother used to say that the most scared dog in the world will still wag its tail if you speak to it softly. She said that being afraid of someone does not mean you have to be mean to them. Commander Yuna took a step closer to the table. The floor trembled under her weight, but her movement was more careful now, less like an earthquake and more like someone trying not to break something precious. The red light behind her visor seemed dimmer, more like the glow of sunset than the fire of destruction. Besides, Taemin added, looking directly at where he thought her eyes might be, anyone who bothers with formal diplomatic protocols, instead of just blowing up the planet, probably does not really want to hurt people. If you wanted to destroy us, you could have done it from space. You came here to talk, which means some part of you wants to find another way. Something remarkable happened. Then Commander Yuna weapons slowly began to retract into her armor. Not all at once and not completely, but inch by inch the devices of mass destruction folded back into hidden compartments. The energy field around her dimmed further. The crackling sounds faded to a quiet hum. Your species is unusual, she said, and now her voice was barely louder than a normal person speaking. She moved closer to the table, each step careful and measured. The other aliens watched in amazement as the most feared being in the galaxy approached a human offering tea, like she was just another visitor. I have conquered 47 star systems, she continued. I have faced the bravest warriors in the galaxy. I have seen entire armies flee at the sight of my ship, but never has anyone offered me tea. Never has anyone told me I do not have to be scary. Taemin finished preparing the first cup and held it out to her. The cup looked impossibly tiny in comparison to her armored hands, but she reached for it with surprising gentleness. Her lower left arm extended while the others remained still. The metal fingers that could crush steel took the delicate porcelain cup like it was made of butterfly wings. The interesting question is, Taemin said, pouring a second cup for himself, are you unusual too, Commander? Yuna stood there holding the teacup, and for a long moment the room was completely silent again. It was not the terrible silence of fear, but something softer, something that felt like possibility. I do not understand, she said finally. You came here yourself, Taemin explained. Instead of sending a subordinate, you announced yourself formally instead of just attacking. You are holding a teacup like it matters to you, which means you remember what it feels like to care about small, gentle things. Most conquerors would have either destroyed us immediately or sent someone else to do the talking. He took a sip of his tea and watched her over the rim of his cup. So, either you are not really a conqueror at heart, or you are a very different kind of conqueror than the galaxy has seen before. Either way, that makes you unusual, and unusual people are always the most interesting to talk to. Commander Yuna stared down at the teacup in her massive armored hand. The red glow behind her visor flickered like she was thinking hard about something. The other aliens in the room had stopped trying to hide and were now watching this impossible conversation with growing amazement. I have not had a conversation, she said slowly, in 47 years. Only interrogations, demands, threats, orders, and reports, but never just talking, never just two people sharing tea and wondering about each other. What did you do before you became a war goddess? Taemin asked gently. The question seemed to hit her like a physical blow. Her helmet jerked up, and the glow behind her visor flared bright for a moment before dimming. Again, she stood very still for so long that Taemin wondered if he had said something wrong before. She repeated the word like it was in a foreign language. Before the Avalon Empire, before the conquests, before you became the most feared being in the galaxy. What did you want to be when you were young? What made you happy? Commander Yuna set the teacup down on the table with infinite care. Her forearms hung at her sides and her massive shoulders slumped slightly. The terrible war goddess, who had made entire civilizations surrender without a fight, suddenly looked very tired. I studied stellar formations, she whispered so quietly that Taemin had to lean forward to hear her. I wanted to understand how stars were born, how they lived, how they died. I thought it was the most beautiful thing in the universe. Her voice grew even softer. I had a garden. The morning started like any other day for Lee Taemin, until the sky turned black with alien ships. The massive warship was so big it covered half the city like a metal cloud, casting shadows everywhere. People ran screaming through the streets, pointing up at the thing that looked like it could swallow buildings whole. Taemin stood on the roof of the government building, watching the ship hover there, silent and terrifying. He was not supposed to be the one talking to aliens today. He was supposed to be home reading books and drinking tea with his cat Mocha, but here he was adjusting his plain blue tie and trying not to shake. The other diplomats had all gotten sick suddenly or found urgent reasons to be somewhere else. The president had looked at him with desperate eyes and said, "You are all we have left." The diplomatic building had been built in just 3 days. Workers had hammered and welded day and night to create something that looked important enough for first contact with aliens. The inside smelled like fresh paint and fear. Taemin walked through the halls looking at all the fancy decorations they had put up to impress their visitors. He wondered if aliens even cared about gold curtains and marble floors. In the main meeting room, other alien species were already waiting. The Galactic Council, they called themselves. Taemin had studied their files all night, but seeing them in person was different. The Zephyrian ambassador looked like a giant blue bird, with too many eyes that blinked in patterns Taemin could not understand. The Vorthek delegates were made of living crystal that hummed sad songs when they moved. Even the friendly-looking Kellen representative had tentacles that kept reaching toward hidden weapons. Everyone was nervous. Taemin could tell because the bird alien kept ruffling its feathers and the crystal people were humming faster. The Kellen was making clicking sounds that might have been swear words in their language. Nobody wanted to be here when she arrived. Commander Yuna of the Avalon Empire, even her name made the other aliens uncomfortable. When they talked about her, they whispered like children telling ghost stories. She had conquered 47 star systems. In the last decade, her army had never lost a battle. Her warship could crack planets in half if she wanted. The story said she was 3 meters tall with 4 arms that each held weapons of mass destruction. They said her armor was made from the metal of dead stars and her helmet was forged in the heart of a black hole. But the worst stories were about her face. Nobody had ever seen it and lived to tell about it. Some said she had no face at all, just swirling darkness where features should be. Others claimed she had the face of every person she had ever killed, constantly shifting and screaming. Some brave souls insisted she was beautiful, but that her beauty was so terrible it drove people insane. Just to look at her, Herdeman had packed a small bag with simple things: tea leaves from his grandmother's garden and a few cookies his neighbor had made. A small potted cherry blossom tree that was barely bigger than his hand. His mother had always told him that when meeting someone new, you should bring a gift, even if that someone was a war goddess who could probably vaporize him with a thought. Room fell silent, not the normal kind of silent, but the deep, awful silence that happens when death walks into a room. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. The lights dimmed even though nobody touched any switches. The temperature dropped so fast that Taemin could see his own breath. Then the doors opened. They did not open normally like doors should. They exploded outward with a sound like thunder being born. Each door weighed half a ton, but they flew off their hinges like paper in a hurricane. The metal screamed as it twisted. The marble floor cracked under some invisible pressure that came before her. She filled the doorway completely. Commander Yuna was everything the story said and worse. She stood 3 meters tall, but somehow seemed even bigger, like she was taking up more space than physics should allow. Her armor was black as the space between stars, but it moved like it was alive. Energy crackled around her in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Her forearms were each the size of a normal person, and the weapons they held hummed with power that could level mountains. The Zephyrian ambassador took one look at her and flew straight up through the ceiling, leaving a bird-shaped hole in the metal of the vortex. Delegates began praying in their crystal voices, but their song was full of terror now. The Kellen representative tried to back away, but hit the wall and just stood there shaking. But it was her helmet that made everyone want to run. It was not just black metal. It was absence itself, shaped into something that might have once been a face. The visor glowed with red light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere. The whole thing moved slightly, like it was breathing, or maybe like it was deciding which person in the room to kill first. When she spoke, the windows cracked. Umans, her voice boomed, and the sound seemed to come from inside everyone heads as much as from her throat. You will submit to the Avalon Empire or face extinction. The energy around her armor flared brighter. Weapon systems activated with sounds like dying stars. Her lower 2 arms pointed devices at the remaining aliens, while her upper arms aimed something that looked like it could punch holes through planets at Taming your species will kneel. Her voice continued. Oh, are your species will burn. The choice is yours, but you will decide. Now Taemin looked at this creature of nightmare and war, this being who had turned conquest into an art form, this walking weapon, who could probably destroy his entire planet without breaking whatever she had instead of a sweat. And then he noticed something. Her shoulders were hunched, not like a predator ready to strike, but like someone carrying a weight that was too heavy. Her stance was perfect and terrifying, but there was something in the way she held herself that reminded him of his sister when their parents made her give speeches at school, something that said she was doing what she was supposed to do, not what she wanted to do. When she spoke again, he heard it, the tiny pause before each threat, like she was reading words someone else had written, like she had said these exact words so many times they had lost all meaning, like maybe she was tired of being the monster everyone expected. Your people will bow, or your people will die. There is nitrogen monoxide third OPTON. But Taemin was thinking about his grandmother, how she always said that the scariest looking dogs just needed someone to be gentle with them. He was thinking about his cat, Machi, who hissed at strangers but purred when you offered her treats. He was thinking about how his neighbor, Mrs. Park, always acted tough but cried during sad movies. So he did something that shocked everyone in the room, including himself. He smiled, not a scared smile or a fake diplomatic smile, but the real warm smile he gave to friends and family, the smile his grandmother had taught him to share with anyone who looked like they needed it. He said in his quiet voice that somehow carried clearly through all her thunder and menace, you do not have to be scary with me. Would you like some tea? The silence that followed was different from before. This was not the silence of fear. This was the silence of a universe holding its breath, waiting to see What happened when someone offered kindness to a war goddess for the first time in 300 years of conquest? Commander Yuna stopped mid-threat, her helmet tilted slightly to one side like a confused dog, her weapons powered down just a fraction. Her energy field flickered, and behind that terrible visor something very human and very surprised was looking back at him. Commander Yuna stood motionless beside the small table, her massive, armored form suddenly seeming less threatening and more like someone carrying a burden too heavy for anyone to bear. The teacup sat where she had placed it, still warm, still waiting. Taemin refilled his own cup and then carefully poured fresh tea into hers. The simple action seemed to break whatever spell had frozen her in place. She looked down at the steaming liquid as if she had never seen anything like it before. Tell me about your garden, he said quietly. For a long moment she did not respond. The other aliens in the room had stopped making any sound at all. Even their breathing seemed muted, as if the universe itself was listening. The energy field around her armor continued to dim until it was barely visible, just a faint shimmer like heat waves on a summer day. It was on the observation deck of my research vessel, she said finally, her voice so soft that it barely carried across the small space. I grew flowers that only bloomed in zero-gravity, things that could never exist on any planet because they needed the emptiness of space to become beautiful. She reached for the teacup again, and this time she lifted it all the way to where her mouth would be behind the helmet. There was a soft hiss as some kind of feeding mechanism activated, and she actually drank. The Taemin watched her shoulders relax just slightly. I had stellar blooms that sang when the solar winds touched them, she continued, and now there was something in her voice that had not been there before, something warm and alive. Void orchids that only opened during eclipse cycles, nebula moss that glowed like captured starlight and grew in patterns that matched the cosmic background radiation. What did they smell like? Taemin asked. Commander Yuna helmet turned toward him, and he could feel her surprise at the question. No one had ever asked her that before. He realized no one had ever cared about the details that made her garden special to her. The stellar bloom smelled like ozone and copper after a lightning storm, she said, and her voice was growing stronger, more alive with each word. The void orchids smelled like morning rain on metal surfaces, and the nebula moss, she paused as if the memory was almost too precious to share. It smelled like hope, yes, like the feeling you get when you see the first star come out at twilight, like the moment when you realize that something you thought was impossible might actually happen, like the smell of possibility itself. Taemin smiled and pulled something from his briefcase, a small potted plant barely the size of his hand. It was a cherry blossom sapling with tiny pink buds that had not yet opened. He set it gently on the table. Between them, my grandmother always said that as long as one person remembers beauty, it never really dies. He told her this is from her garden, the same soil where she grew the tea leaves. It is not much, but it is real, and it is alive, and it is beautiful. Commander Yuna stared at the tiny plant like it was a miracle. Her four armored hands hovered around it, not quite touching, but close enough that he could see her fingers trembling slightly. The red glow behind her visor had changed somehow, becoming softer, less threatening, more like the warm light of a fireplace. I remember their names, she said suddenly. Every flower in my garden. I remember exactly how to care for them, what nutrients they needed, what light frequencies helped them grow. I remember the soil mixtures and the water cycles and the way they moved in the artificial breezes. I created. Her voice was full of wonder now, as if she was discovering something about herself that she had forgotten. The stellar blooms sang in harmonies that changed with the season cycles. They would start with simple melodies when they were young and develop complex symphonies as they matured. The void orchids only bloomed once every 3 months, but when they did, the entire deck would fill with their perfume, and the whole ship felt like home. She leaned closer to the table, bringing her massive armored form down to a more human level. I could grow them again, she whispered. I still remember everything, the exact temperature ranges, the mineral content of the water, the timing of the feeding cycles. I could make them bloom again if what Taemin prompted gently, if I had somewhere safe to plant them, if I did not have to be a weapon anymore, if someone would let me be the person who grows flowers instead of the person who destroys worlds. There was such longing in her voice that it made Taemin heartache. He thought about his grandmother's garden, about the way her face lit up when the cherry blossoms bloomed each spring about how she would sit among her plants for hours just watching them grow. Commander Yuna reached up with her upper right hand and touched something on the side of her helmet. There was a soft hiss and a series of clicks. The terrible mask that had hidden her face began to retract, folding back into the collar of her armor. The other aliens gasped. Her face was not human, but it was not monstrous either. Her skin had a blue tint like twilight sky, and her eyes were large and bright like distant stars. Her features were sharp and elegant, with high cheekbones and a pointed chin. Her hair was long and dark and had been pressed flat by the helmet, but what struck Taemin most was how young she looked. Not young in years, perhaps, but young in the way that someone looks when they have been carrying a weight that is too heavy for them for too long. Young in the way that his sister had looked when their parents finally stopped making her take piano lessons. She hated young, like someone who had just remembered who they used to be before the world told them who they had to become. Tears were running down her blue-tinged cheeks, silver tears that caught the light like liquid starlight. "I burned it myself," she whispered, and her voice broke on the words, "I burned my own garden. With my own hands. They made me do it to prove I was ready to be their war goddess," they said. "I had to destroy what I loved most to show that I could destroy anything." She looked at the tiny cherry blossom sapling through her tears. "I killed every flower I had grown, every beautiful thing I had created. I watched them burn, and I did not cry because they told me that war goddesses do not cry, but I wanted to. I wanted to cry for every bloom that turned to ash, for every song that went silent, for every perfect thing I had murdered with my own hands." Taemin reached across the table, not to touch her, but to push the little plant closer to her. "What if you did not have to be their war goddess anymore?" he asked. "What if you could just be Yuna, who grows flowers and studies stars? What if you could have a garden again?" She looked at him with those bright, strange eyes, full of tears and hope and fear, all mixed together. "Is that what you are offering?" she asked. "A place where someone like me could grow flowers instead of burning worlds?" Taemin smiled, his grandmother warm, gentle smile. "Commander Yuna," he said softly, "Earth has 7 billion people, and every single one of them knows what it is like to want to be seen as more than what others expect them to be. We have gardeners and warriors, scientists and artists, people who are gentle and people who are fierce, and most of us are a little bit of everything." He gestured to the cherry blossom sapling. "We have room for someone who loves flowers and was forced to become a war goddess. We have soil and sunlight and people who understand that the most beautiful things in the universe need time and care and patience to grow." For the first time in 300 years, Commander Yuna smiled. The smile that crossed Commander Yuna's face was like watching the sunrise after a long, dark winter. It started small, just a tiny upward curve at the corners of her mouth, but it spread across her features, like light spreading across water. Her star bright eyes crinkled at the edges, and for a moment the most feared being in the galaxy looked exactly like what she had always been underneath all the armor and weapons and terrible reputation. A person who had once loved growing things. Tae-Min felt something tight in his chest loosen as he watched her transformation. The other aliens in the room were staring in complete amazement. The Kellen representative had stopped making frightened noises and was actually leaning forward with curiosity. The crystal beings had started humming again, but now their song was soft and wondering instead of terrified. Over the next few hours, something unprecedented happened in galactic diplomatic history. Commander Yuna sat down, not in the imposing way she had been trained to do, with weapons displayed and energy crackling around her like a storm, but carefully, gently, as if she was afraid of breaking something precious. She folded her long legs under her and leaned forward over the small table, bringing herself down to human eye level. The teacups looked impossibly tiny in her large hands, but she held them with the same delicate care she might have used with her flowers. Her movements were precise and thoughtful, like someone who remembered what it meant to nurture fragile things. "Tell me about Earth Gardens," she said, and her voice had lost all traces of artificial menace. Now she just sounded curious, excited, even like a student asking a favorite teacher about their subject. Min pulled out his phone and showed her pictures he had taken of his grandmother garden. Cherry blossoms in full bloom, creating clouds of pink and white petals. Vegetable patches with neat rows of green plants climbing toward the sun, small flowers scattered between the larger plants, adding splashes of color like scattered jewels. This Is where the tea came from, he explained, pointing to a section of the garden where neat rows of tea plants grew in careful lines. My grandmother planted these when she was young like you were when you started your star garden. She tended them for 60 years, learning exactly what they needed to grow strong and healthy. Una leaned closer to the small screen, her eyes wide with fascination. 60 years, she breathed. That is longer than some species live. She must have loved them very much. She did, Taemin said warmly. She used to say that plants were like children. They needed different things at different times, and if you paid attention, they would tell you what they needed. She could look at a plant and know if it was thirsty or lonely or getting too much sun. Lonely, Yuna repeated. Plants can be lonely, oh yes. Taemin nodded. Some plants grow better when they have companions, plants that help each other by sharing nutrients through their roots, or by providing shade, or by attracting beneficial insects. My grandmother always planted marigolds next to her tomatoes because the marigolds kept away harmful bugs. He swiped to another picture showing a section of the garden where different plants grew together in seemingly random but actually carefully planned arrangements. She called it companion planting. Making sure that everything in the garden had a friend. Yuna stared at the image for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. In my garden, she said slowly, I never thought about companions. I grew each species separately in their own sections. I thought they would be safer that way, less chance of one species harming another, but maybe, Taemin suggested gently, they were also lonelier that way. The idea seemed to strike her like a revelation. Her eyes widened and she sat back slightly, her four hands moving restlessly as if she was replanting her entire garden in her mind. I could try again, she said, and her voice was full of wonder. I could plant them together this time. Let the stellar blooms sing harmonies with the void orchids. Let the nebula moss grow around their roots so they could all glow together. She looked at Taemin with growing excitement. Do you think it would work? Do you think they would be happier growing together? Think, Taemin said with certainty, that anything grown with love and care has a better chance of being happy. And I think plants that grow together learn to help each other in ways we never expect. He pulled out another item from his briefcase, a small notebook filled with his grandmother handwriting. These are her gardening notes. He explained everything she learned about growing things over 60 years. Which plants like to grow together, which ones need more water, which ones bloom at different times so you can have flowers all year long. Yuna reached for the notebook with trembling hands. She opened it carefully and stared at the pages covered with neat handwriting and small sketches of plants. The notes were in Korean, but somehow that did not seem to matter. She traced the drawings with one finger as if she could absorb the knowledge through touch. She wrote it all down. Yuna whispered every detail, every lesson. She cared enough to remember everything. My grandmother always said that knowledge without sharing is just selfishness, Taemin told her. She would have wanted you to have this. She would have been excited to know that someone who understood the joy of growing things was learning from her. Work. Tears started flowing down Yuna's cheeks again, but these were different from before. These were tears of gratitude and hope instead of grief and loss. I want to try, she said, looking up from the notebook. I want to plant a garden where stellar blooms and void orchids grow together, where nebula moss can spread between different species and help them all glow brighter. I want to see what happens when things that were meant to be separate learn to be companions. She paused and looked directly at Taemin. Want to learn how to be a companion too instead of a weapon. I want to learn how to help things grow instead of destroying them. I want to remember what it feels like to create something beautiful and then watch it become even more beautiful over time. The transformation in her was remarkable. The terrifying war goddess who had entered the room hours ago was still there in her size and strength and the obvious power of her alien technology. But now she looked like someone who had just remembered a dream she thought was lost forever. Someone who had found hope in the most unexpected place. What would you need? Taemin asked. To start again, I mean. What would you need to have a garden? Yuna thought carefully, her expression serious and thoughtful. Soil, she said. A place where roots can grow deep and strong, clean water and clean air, sunlight, or the right kind of artificial light, time and patience, and someone who cares enough to pay attention. When things go wrong, she looked around the diplomatic room with its fancy decorations and formal furniture. Not here, she added with a small laugh, not in a place designed for talking about treaties and trade agreements. Gardens need quiet spaces where You can think and listen to what the plants are trying to tell you. Min smiled. I know just the place, he said, where my grandmother's house in Bizan. It has been empty since she died last year, but the garden is still there, still growing. The cherry blossoms she planted are getting ready to bloom, and there is plenty of space for new plants that sing in solar winds and glow like captured starlight. Yuna's eyes went wide with possibility. You would let me, she began, then stopped as if the idea was too wonderful to put into words. I would be honored, Taemin said simply. My grandmother always said that gardens were meant to be shared, that the best gardens were the ones where different gardeners brought their own knowledge and their own plants and learned from each other. Gestured to the cherry blossom sapling still sitting on the table between them. Besides, I think she would love to meet someone who understands that growing beautiful things is one of the most important jobs in the universe. Commander Yuna picked up the tiny plant and held it close to her chest. Her smile was radiant now, bright enough to light up the entire room. I would like that, she said, very much. The next 3 days passed like a dream that was too good to be real. Commander Yuna had moved her massive warship to a parking orbit around Earth, where it no longer cast shadows over entire cities instead of the dark, threatening presence it had been when it first arrived. It now seemed almost protective, hovering quietly in space like a guardian watching over something precious inside. The diplomatic facility, the formal meeting rooms, had been abandoned in favor of a small garden courtyard that Taemin had discovered on the second day. It had probably been designed as decoration, but it had real soil and real sunlight streaming through glass panels overhead. Most importantly, it was quiet, away from the crowds and cameras and politicians who wanted to turn their conversations into photo opportunities. Shana spent hours each day in that small space teaching Taemin about stellar formations while he showed her Earth botanical databases on his tablet. She would point to pictures of distant nebulae and explain how stellar winds carried the minerals that her flowers needed to grow. He would show her time-lapse videos of cherry blossoms blooming and explain how Earth seasons worked and why some plants needed cold winters to bloom properly in spring. It was during one of these peaceful conversations that Commander Kong Duhain burst through the courtyard doors, his face grim and his military uniform wrinkled like he had been running. They are coming, he announced without preamble. 3 more Avalon warships just dropped out of hyperspace. They will be here in 6 hours, and they are not here for diplomatic talks. The peaceful atmosphere shattered like glass. Yuna, who had been kneeling beside the small garden bed they had started together, rose to her full 3-meter height. Her face went pale, her blue-tinged skin taking on an almost gray cast. The transformation was immediate and heartbreaking, like watching someone remember a nightmare they had been trying to forget. They are coming for me, she said quietly but with absolute certainty. The Avalon Empire does not tolerate defection, especially from their war goddesses. They sent me here to conquer this system, and instead I am. She gestured helplessly at the small plants they had been tending together, at the notebook full of gardening advice, at the cherry blossom sapling that had started to show signs of new growth. Instead, I am learning to grow things again. Commander Kong stepped closer, his expression serious but not unkind. Can you fight 3 warships alone? He asked. Yuna laughed, but there was no humor in it, only sadness. I am one of their most powerful weapons, she said, but I am still just one weapon against 3 ships full of weapons. They did not send a diplomatic mission, Commander Kong. They sent an execution squad. Min felt his heart sink as he watched the light fade from Yuna's eyes. The woman who had been excitedly planning a garden just minutes ago was disappearing, replaced by the exhausted war goddess who had first walked into that diplomatic meeting. The weight of her old life was settling back onto her shoulders like a familiar but hated coat. Will you have to go back? He asked, though he already knew he did not want to hear the answer. For a moment Yuna just stood there, looking at the small garden they had created together, the few earth plants they had successfully grown alongside some alien seeds she had retrieved from her ship, small green shoots reaching toward the sunlight, tiny flowers that were just beginning to open, simple, beautiful proof that different species could grow together and make each other stronger. No, she said finally, and the word came out firm and clear. The transformation that followed was remarkable but also terrifying. Yuna's armor began to shift and change, but not in the way it had when she was powering down for peaceful conversation. This time it was expanding, growing brighter, crackling with more energy than Taemin had ever seen. The war goddess was returning, but she was different now. This was not the cold, efficient killing machine that had first entered the diplomatic facility. This was someone fighting to protect something precious, someone who had tasted hope and refused to let it be taken away. "I will not go back," she said, and her voice carried new harmonics of power and determination. "I will not let them destroy this. I will not let them turn me back into their weapon. I will not let them burn another garden." She turned to look at Commander Kong and Taemin, and her expression was fierce but not frightening. It was the fierceness of a mother protecting her children, the intensity of a gardener defending her flowers from a storm. "You showed me something I thought was lost forever," she said to Taemin. "You reminded me that I used to be someone who created beautiful things instead of destroying them. You gave me hope that I could be that person again." Her armor finished its transformation. It was still clearly designed for war, but now it incorporated patterns that reminded Taemin of flower petals and growing vines. The energy that crackled around her had changed too, becoming less chaotic and more purposeful, like controlled lightning. "Now let me show you what a war goddess can do when she is fighting to protect something she chooses to love instead of destroying what she is ordered to hate." Commander Kong stepped forward, his expression worried. "You cannot fight 3 warships alone," he repeated. "Even if you are protecting something precious, the mathematics are against you." Yuna smiled, and it was the same warm expression she had worn while looking at pictures of cherry blossoms, but now it carried an edge that made the air itself seem to vibrate with potential energy. "Who said I would be alone?" she asked before either human could respond. Alarms began blaring throughout the facility. Emergency lights flashed red and automated voices announced that unknown ships were approaching Earth. But these were not the harsh, threatening tones of invasion alerts. These were confused, uncertain warnings because something unprecedented was happening. Through the glass panels overhead, they could see lights moving across the sky, not the harsh white glare of military engines, but softer colors, blues and greens and gentle golds that painted aurora patterns across the atmosphere. 3 Avalon warships had indeed arrived in Earth orbit, but they were not alone. Following behind them came dozens of other ships that had broken away from the Avalon fleet, ships that had been carrying other war goddesses, other beings who had been turned into weapons against their will, other people who had once loved growing things or studying stars, or creating music before they were forced to become instruments of conquest. The communication system crackled to life and voices began speaking in the harmonic language of the Avalon Empire, but these were not orders or threats, these were questions. Tentative, hopeful questions asking if it was really true that there was a place where war goddesses could grow gardens instead of burning worlds. Yuna looked up at the lights painting patterns across the sky, and her smile grew even brighter, it seems. She said to Taemin that your offer of tea and kindness has reached farther than we expected. She activated her own communication system and began speaking in her native language. Her voice carried clearly through the speakers, warm and welcoming, but also strong and determined. As she spoke, the lights in the sky began to move, repositioning themselves around Earth, not as a besieging force, but as a protective formation. "What are you telling them?" Taemin asked. "I am telling them about cherry blossoms," Yuna replied. "I'm telling them about companion planting and gardening notebooks and humans who offer tea to strangers. I am telling them that there is a place where former weapons can learn to grow beautiful things instead of destroying them." She looked at him with eyes that sparkled like captured starlight. "And I am telling them that sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is choose what you fight for instead of letting others choose what you fight against." Above them, the sky filled with lights as more and more ships broke away from the Avalon fleet, drawn by the promise of gardens and hope and the revolutionary idea that warriors could choose to become gardeners. The real battle, Yuna realized, was not going to be fought with weapons at all. It was going to be fought with tea and kindness and the irresistible power of people choosing to grow beautiful things together. The battle that followed became legend throughout the galaxy, not because of its destruction, but because there was no destruction at all. When the 3 Avalon Empire ships arrived to drag Commander Yuna back to her life of conquest, they found themselves facing something completely unexpected. Instead of one rogue war goddess hiding on a primitive planet, they discovered 47 former weapons of mass destruction, who had all chosen the same impossible thing. They had chosen to grow gardens instead of burning worlds. the space around Earth filled with ships of every size and design, vessels that had once carried fear across star systems now hung peaceful in the void, their weapons powered down, their energy signatures calmed. The war goddesses who commanded them spoke to each other in languages that had not been used for conversation in centuries. Voices that had only known how to give orders and demand surrender were now asking gentle questions. About soil composition and growing seasons, Commander? Yuna stood in the observation deck of her own ship, looking out at the incredible sight. Her armor had completed its transformation over the past few days, becoming something that was still clearly powerful but also undeniably beautiful. The dark metal now had veins of silver running through it like the stems of growing plants. The energy field around her had changed from the harsh crackling of weapon systems to something softer that reminded Taemin of Aurora dancing in a night sky beside her. Taemin held a cup of tea and marveled at how different everything looked when seen from space. Earth hung below them, blue and green and white, a living jewel, spinning slowly in the darkness, and surrounding it like protective flowers were the ships of beings who had once been forced to destroy planets, but now wanted to learn how to help them bloom. It is working, Yuna said softly as they watched another Avalon ship break formation and drift toward their growing fleet instead of fighting. "US, they are joining." Usher's voice carried wonder and hope, but also something deeper. A satisfaction that came from watching seeds you had planted finally start to grow. Taemin had seen the same expression on his grandmother's face when her cherry blossoms bloomed each spring. The communication systems buzzed constantly now with messages from across the galaxy. Former war goddesses sharing memories of what they had been before they were turned into weapons scientists who remembered studying black holes, poets who had once written songs about starbirth, engineers who had built beautiful cities before they were forced to design weapons, in the ship gardens that were springing up everywhere. The impossible was happening. Stellar blooms sang their wind songs, while earth marigolds added bright splashes of color. Void orchids opened during eclipse cycles alongside roses that had been grown in Taemin grandmother soil. Nebula moss that glowed like captured hope spread between vegetable plants that would feed crews tired of military rations. The Avalon Empire commanders who had come to retrieve their rogue weapons found themselves faced with a problem they had never encountered. How do you recapture weapons that have convinced other weapons to stop being weapons? How do you threaten people who are protecting something they love more than they feared destruction? Some of the Empire ships tried to fight at first. They fired warning shots and issued ultimatums, but their threats rang hollow when they were outnumbered 50-1 by beings they had trained to be unstoppable in combat. When your own weapons turn against you because someone offered them tea and the chance to grow flowers, you start to realize that maybe fear is not the most powerful force in the universe. After all, within a week, the 3 Avalon ships that had come to drag Yuna home were asking permission to stay. Their crews were tired of being afraid all the time, tired of conquering worlds they had no interest in ruling, tired of turning sensitive souls into monsters and calling it strength. They wanted to learn about companion planting and seasonal growing cycles. They wanted to know if there was room in the gardens for people who had spent so long destroying things that they had forgotten how to create. Taemin found himself teaching botany to beings from 40 different star systems. He showed crystal entities how to grow plants in mineral soil. He explained photosynthesis to creatures who had never seen a sun. He helped energy beings understand how earth flowers use color and scent to attract beneficial insects. But the most amazing transformations happened in the individual gardens. Commander Yuna garden became the heart of their small revolution, built in the center of her massive warship, where the primary weapons array used to be. It combined growing techniques from dozens of worlds. Her stellar blooms sang harmonies with earth wind chimes. Void orchids shared root space with cherry trees that bloomed in impossible colors when exposed to alien starlight. Nebula moss glowed in patterns that matched the growth cycles of companion plants, creating living art that changed with each season. Other former war goddesses built their own gardens, each one unique and wonderful. Commander Hana